Hello, and welcome back to Speak English Daily.
Hi, everyone. We are very happy to see you here today.
Have you ever said yes to something and immediately felt that quiet regret settle in your chest?
You mean that moment when your mouth says yes, but everything inside you is screaming no?
Exactly. It's subtle, but it's powerful. Someone asks for your time, your energy, your help, and before you even think, you agree. Not because you want to, but because it feels easier than saying no.
Easier in the moment, but heavier afterward.
That's the part most people don't talk about, the emotional weight that follows a yes you didn't mean. You start replaying the situation in your mind. You think, why did I agree to this? Why didn't I just say no?
And then you try to justify it. You tell yourself, it's not a big deal, I'll manage, I don't want to disappoint them.
But deep down, you know the truth. You didn't say yes out of genuine willingness. You said yes because you were afraid of something.
Afraid of what, though? Because on the surface, it seems harmless. It's just a small favor, a small commitment.
It's rarely about the favor itself. It's about what we think saying no might cost us. We worry about how people will see us. We worry about being labeled as difficult, selfish, or unhelpful.
So instead of risking discomfort for a few seconds, we choose to carry discomfort for hours or even days.
And it adds up. One yes becomes 10, 10 becomes a pattern. And before you realize it, your time doesn't feel like your own anymore.
That's when people start feeling stuck, like they're constantly busy, constantly drained, but they don't even know why.
Because they've built a life where everyone else's priorities come first. Not intentionally, but gradually, quietly.
It's interesting because most people think being agreeable makes life smoother. They think it keeps relationships stable.
But what it actually does is create silent resentment. You start feeling frustrated, not just with others, but with yourself.
That frustration is important. It's a signal. It's your mind telling you that something is off.
Yes, it's not something to ignore, it's something to listen to. Because every time you say yes when you mean no, you're teaching people how to treat your time and your boundaries.
And more importantly, you're teaching yourself that your needs come second.
That's where the real problem begins, not in what others ask of you, but in what you allow.
So the real question isn't just why people ask for too much, it's why we keep giving more than we can afford.
And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most of the time, it's not because we're kind, it's because we're afraid.
Afraid of conflict, afraid of rejection, afraid of being misunderstood.
And until you face that fear, you'll keep saying yes even when it costs you your peace, your energy, and your time.
So this isn't really a conversation about saying no. It's a conversation about understanding why saying no feels so difficult in the first place.
Because once you understand that, everything starts to change.
And that's where we need to go next.
Let's take this a step further. Because once you notice this pattern of saying yes when you mean no, you start to see the consequences more clearly.
And they're not always obvious at first.
No, they build quietly. At first, it feels manageable. You take on one extra task, one extra responsibility, one extra favor. You tell yourself it's temporary.
But it rarely stays temporary.
Exactly. Because once people see you as someone who always says yes, they start expecting it. Not in a malicious way, just naturally.
You become reliable, but in the wrong way. Not because you're strong with your time, but because you're flexible with your boundaries.
And flexibility without limits turns into exhaustion. You start feeling constantly busy, but not fulfilled.
That's an important distinction. Being busy doesn't mean you're moving forward. Sometimes it just means you're being pulled in too many directions.
And the worst part? You begin to lose clarity. You don't even know what you actually want to do anymore because your schedule is filled with things you didn't choose.
That's when people start feeling disconnected from themselves.
Yes, because every unnecessary yes is a small step away from your own priorities. It's time you could have spent growing, resting, thinking, or building something meaningful.
Instead, it gets consumed by obligations that were never truly yours.
And over time, that creates resentment. Not always loud or obvious, but it's there. You feel irritated, drained, sometimes even angry, and you don't fully understand why.
Because on the surface, you're doing the right thing. You're helping, you're showing up, you're being dependable.
But internally, there's a conflict. You're giving more than you can sustain. And that imbalance starts affecting everything: your mood, your energy, even your relationships.
It's ironic, isn't it? The very thing you do to maintain relationships, always saying yes, can slowly damage them.
Because eventually, that hidden frustration leaks out, maybe in your tone, your patience, or your lack of enthusiasm.
Or you start avoiding people altogether just to protect your time.
And that's when it becomes clear. Saying yes all the time doesn't make your life easier, it makes it heavier.
It turns your time into something that others control instead of something you manage intentionally.
And here's the deeper cost. You begin to lose respect for your own boundaries because you're not enforcing them.
And if you don't respect your own boundaries, it's unrealistic to expect others to respect them.
That's the turning point, realizing that every yes has a cost, not just in time, but in energy, focus, and peace of mind.
So the goal isn't to stop helping people, it's to stop helping at the expense of yourself.
Because when you constantly sacrifice your own needs, you don't become a better person, you become a more exhausted one.
And exhaustion is not a sustainable way to live.
Let me ask our listeners something. How many times have you said yes to something recently, even though you really wanted to say no? Be honest with yourself. And if you're comfortable, share your answer in the comments.
Because awareness is the first step. Once you start noticing these patterns, you can begin to change them.
And that change starts with understanding why saying no feels so uncomfortable in the first place.
That's where things get deeper.
So now we need to face the real question. Why is saying no so uncomfortable for so many people?
Because logically, it shouldn't be that hard. It's just one word.
But emotionally, it carries a lot of weight. For many people, saying no feels like they're doing something wrong.
Almost like they're breaking an unspoken rule.
Exactly. And most of these unspoken rules were learned a long time ago. Growing up, many of us were taught to be polite, to be helpful, to not disappoint others.
Which sounds like a good thing on the surface.
It is, until it becomes unconditional, until being helpful means ignoring your own limits.
That's where the problem starts, when kindness turns into obligation.
And then there's the fear of rejection. A lot of people don't say yes because they want to. They say yes because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't.
Afraid that people might think less of them.
Or that they might lose a relationship, an opportunity, or someone's approval.
Approval is a big one. People don't always realize how much their decisions are influenced by the need to be liked.
And saying no feels like risking that. It feels like you're stepping out of line, like you're creating tension.
Even if the situation doesn't actually require that level of fear.
Right, because most of the time, the consequences we imagine are much worse than reality, but in the moment, it feels real.
There's also guilt, that immediate feeling of, I should help, I should say yes, I shouldn't let them down.
That word should is powerful. It creates pressure. It makes you feel like you're obliged even when you're not.
And the more you act on that pressure, the stronger it becomes.
It turns into a habit. You stop questioning it. You just automatically say yes because that's what you've trained yourself to do.
So over time, it's no longer a conscious decision, it's a reflex.
And breaking that reflex takes awareness. You have to pause and ask yourself, do I actually want to do this?
That pause is uncomfortable at first,
Very, because you're interrupting a pattern that has been running for years, and your mind will try to push you back into the familiar response.
which is to say yes and avoid the discomfort.
But the key thing to understand, the discomfort of saying no is temporary. It lasts a few seconds, maybe a few minutes.
But the discomfort of saying yes when you mean no, that can last much longer.
Hours, days, sometimes even longer. And it doesn't just affect that one moment, it affects your energy, your focus, your mindset.
So you're choosing between short-term discomfort and long-term frustration.
And most people, without realizing it, keep choosing the long-term frustration.
Because it feels safer in the moment.
But safety isn't always growth. Sometimes growth feels uncomfortable, especially at the beginning.
And learning to say no is one of those skills. It challenges how you see yourself and how you think others see you.
But once you understand that these fears are learned, not permanent, you start to see that they can be changed.
You're not stuck with this pattern. You just need to recognize it first.
And once you recognize it, you can start shifting how you respond.
That's where everything begins to open up.
Because now it's not about reacting automatically, it's about choosing intentionally.
And that choice changes everything.
Now that you understand why saying no feels so difficult, this is where things begin to shift.
Because awareness alone isn't enough. You need a new way of thinking.
Exactly. And the biggest shift starts with one idea. Saying no is not selfish.
That's a hard one for people to accept.
Because for a long time, we've been taught the opposite. We've been told that putting others first is always the right thing to do.
But what this really means is people confuse self-respect with selfishness.
Yes, and they're not the same thing. Selfishness is when you ignore others completely, but boundaries are about not ignoring yourself.
That's a powerful distinction.
When you say no to something that drains you, you're not hurting anyone. You're protecting your energy, your time, and your focus.
And those are limited resources.
Exactly. You don't have unlimited time. You don't have unlimited energy. So every yes needs to be intentional.
Otherwise, you end up spending your life reacting instead of choosing.
And here's something most people don't realize. When you start setting boundaries, the right people will respect you more, not less.
Because they see clarity. They see that you value your time.
And people tend to respect what you clearly protect.
It's when you're unclear, when you say yes to everything, that people start pushing more and more.
Because there's no signal telling them where the limit is.
So in a way, boundaries don't push people away, they define how people can approach you.
Exactly. They create structure in your relationships. They remove confusion.
And they also change how you see yourself.
That's the most important part. When you start saying no intentionally, you begin to trust yourself more.
Because you're finally acting in alignment with what you actually want.
And that builds confidence. Not loud confidence, but quiet, steady confidence.
The kind that doesn't need approval.
Yes, because you're no longer making decisions based on how others might react. You're making decisions based on what's right for you.
That's a completely different mindset.
And it takes practice. At first, it might feel uncomfortable. You might second-guess yourself.
But over time, it becomes natural.
Because you start seeing the results. You feel less overwhelmed. You feel more in control of your time.
And your relationships become more honest.
Because you're no longer pretending to be available when you're not.
That honesty builds stronger connections, not weaker ones.
Exactly. People know where you stand, and that clarity is valuable.
So the goal isn't to say no to everything.
No, the goal is to say yes to the right things and no to the rest.
And that requires one simple question.
Does this align with what I actually want, or am I just trying to avoid discomfort?
That question alone can change your decisions.
Because it forces you to pause, and in that pause, you create space to choose differently.
And that's where real control begins.
Not in managing everything, but in choosing what deserves your energy.
And once you understand that, saying no stops feeling like a problem,
It starts feeling like a skill.
and a necessary one.
Now that the mindset is shifting, let's make this more practical. Because boundaries are not just an idea, they show up in very specific areas of your life.
And if you don't recognize those areas, it's easy to miss where things are going wrong.
Exactly. Most people think of boundaries as one big concept, but in reality, there are different types, and each one affects your life in a different way.
So where do we start?
Let's start with time. This is one of the most common areas where people struggle. Your time is constantly being requested, interrupted, or taken without you realizing it.
Meetings, calls, favors, last-minute plans.
And the problem is, if you don't protect your time, other people will fill it for you. Not intentionally, but naturally.
Because everyone has their own priorities.
Exactly. So a time boundary might sound like, I'm not available today, or I can't take this on right now.
Simple, but not always easy to say.
Yes, but necessary, because every time you say yes to something that doesn't matter, you're saying no to something that does.
That's a powerful trade-off.
The next one is energy. This one is more subtle. It's not just about how much time something takes, it's about how it makes you feel.
Some conversations drain you. Some environments exhaust you.
Exactly. And if you're not aware of that, you keep putting yourself in situations that leave you mentally and emotionally tired.
So an energy boundary could be stepping away from certain conversations or limiting how long you stay in certain situations.
Yes, it's about recognizing what drains you and giving yourself permission to step back.
That requires honesty with yourself.
It does, and that honesty leads to the next type, emotional boundaries. This is about what you take on from others.
You mean when people expect you to carry their stress, their problems, their emotions?
Exactly. Supporting someone is one thing, absorbing everything they feel is something else.
And many people don't see the difference.
Because they think being supportive means being available all the time, for everything. But that's not sustainable.
No, it's not. An emotional boundary might sound like, I understand what you're going through, but I need some space right now.
That's respectful, but still clear. And that's the key. Boundaries are not about being harsh, they're about being clear.
What's another area where boundaries show up?
Social boundaries. This includes invitations, gatherings, and expectations to always show up.
Saying yes to events you don't want to attend just to avoid awkwardness.
Exactly. And over time, that becomes exhausting. You start attending things out of obligation, not interest.
So a social boundary could be as simple as, I won't be able to make it this time.
Yes. No long explanations, no over-justifying, just clarity.
It sounds simple when you say it like that.
It is simple, but simple doesn't mean easy, especially when you're not used to it.
So the goal is to start recognizing which area you struggle with the most.
Exactly. Because once you identify it, you can start making small changes.
And those small changes build over time.
Yes. You don't need to fix everything at once. Just start noticing where your boundaries are weak.
And then strengthen them, one situation at a time.
That's how it becomes real. Not just something you understand, but something you practice.
And once you start practicing it, you begin to see the difference.
So now comes the part most people are waiting for. How do you actually say no?
Because understanding boundaries is one thing, expressing them in real situations is something else.
Exactly. And this is where people hesitate, not because they don't know what to say, but because they overthink how it will be received.
They try to find the perfect wording, the perfect tone, the perfect moment.
But here's the truth. Saying no doesn't need to be complicated. In fact, the more you complicate it, the harder it becomes.
So what does a clear no actually sound like?
It's simple, calm, direct, and respectful. For example, I can't take this on right now.
No long explanation, no unnecessary detail.
Exactly. Most people feel the need to justify their decision. They start adding reasons, excuses, and explanations, hoping the other person will accept it more easily.
But that often backfires.
Yes, because the more you explain, the more room you create for negotiation. People might try to change your mind or find a way around your answer.
So keeping it simple actually makes it stronger.
It does. Another example could be, I won't be able to join, or that doesn't work for me.
Short, clear, and complete.
And notice something important. You're not apologizing for having a boundary.
That's a big shift.
Because many people start with, I'm really sorry, but even when they've done nothing wrong.
Which makes it sound like they're asking for permission instead of making a decision.
Exactly. You're not asking, you're informing. There's a difference.
What about tone? Because sometimes it's not what you say, it's how you say it.
Tone matters a lot. You don't need to sound cold or defensive, just calm and steady.
So not aggressive, but not hesitant either.
Yes. If you sound unsure, people will sense that, and they might push back, not because they're trying to be difficult, but because your message isn't firm.
So confidence makes your no clearer.
Exactly. And confidence doesn't mean being loud. It means being certain.
What if someone asks for a reason?
You can give a simple one if you want, but keep it brief. For example, I have other priorities right now.
That's enough.
More than enough. You don't owe a detailed explanation of your schedule or your decisions.
That's another mindset shift, realizing you don't need to justify everything.
Yes, because when you start believing that, saying no becomes much easier.
What about situations where you feel pressured in the moment?
That's where a pause helps. You don't have to answer immediately. You can say, let me think about it, or I'll get back to you.
That gives you space to decide instead of reacting automatically.
Exactly. It breaks the habit of saying yes too quickly.
And once you decide, you can respond clearly.
Yes. And remember, the goal isn't to make the other person happy in that moment. The goal is to stay aligned with your priorities.
That's the part people struggle with the most.
Because they're used to putting others first. But once you start practicing this, it becomes more natural.
And the fear starts to fade.
It does, because you realize that saying no doesn't create as much conflict as you imagined.
And even when it does, it's manageable.
Exactly. Because you're no longer avoiding discomfort, you're handling it.
And that's a skill that grows with practice.
Every time you say no clearly, you reinforce that skill.
And over time, it becomes part of who you are.
Now, here's the part most people worry about. What happens after you say no?
Because that's where the real pressure shows up.
Exactly. It's not just about saying no, it's about how people react to it.
And those reactions can be uncomfortable.
Very. Some people might push back. They might question your decision, try to convince you, or even make you feel guilty.
Like saying, come on, it's just this one time, or I really need your help.
Or even more subtle things, like you've changed, or you're not as available as before.
Which can feel like a personal attack.
Yes, because it challenges your identity, especially if you've always been the person who says yes.
So how do you handle that without giving in?
First, you have to expect it. This is important. When you start setting boundaries, some people will resist, not because they don't like you, but because they were comfortable with the old version of you.
The version that always said yes.
Exactly. And now that you're changing that pattern, it disrupts their expectations.
So resistance is normal.
Completely normal. And once you understand that, it stops feeling personal.
That alone makes it easier to stay firm.
Yes. The next step is to stay consistent. If you say no, don't immediately backtrack just because someone reacts negatively.
Because that teaches them that your no isn't final.
Exactly. It sends the message that your boundary can be pushed.
So consistency builds credibility.
It does. And you don't need to argue or defend yourself. You can simply repeat your position calmly.
Like, I understand, but I'm still not able to do this.
Yes. Calm, respectful, and firm. No need to escalate.
What about guilt? Because even if you handle the situation well, that feeling can still be there.
That's true. And it's important to recognize that guilt doesn't always mean you're doing something wrong.
That's a big one.
Many people feel guilty simply because they're doing something new, something unfamiliar.
So the guilt is coming from the change, not from the action itself.
Exactly. And if you let that guilt control your decisions, you'll go back to old patterns.
So you have to sit with it.
Yes, let it be there without letting it change your decision.
That takes practice.
It does, but over time, that guilt becomes weaker and your confidence becomes stronger.
What about people who try to manipulate the situation?
That happens too. Some people might use pressure, urgency, or emotion to get you to change your answer.
So how do you respond to that without giving in?
By staying grounded. You don't need to match their intensity. You don't need to explain more. Just stay calm and repeat your boundary.
So it's not about winning the conversation.
Exactly. It's about holding your position.
And not getting pulled into unnecessary conflict.
Yes, because the moment you start over-explaining or defending too much, you lose clarity. And clarity is what makes your boundary strong.
Exactly. So keep it simple. Keep it steady.
And trust that the right people will understand.
And even if they don't immediately, they will adjust over time.
Because people learn how to treat you based on what you allow consistently.
That's the key. Not what you say once, but what you reinforce repeatedly.
And once that pattern changes, everything around you starts to shift.
Your time, your energy, your relationships, all of it becomes more balanced.
Because now you're not reacting, you're choosing.
At this point, everything starts coming together.
Because now it's not just about saying no, it's about who you become when you start doing it consistently.
You mean becoming someone who values their time and protects their energy?
Yes. Someone who doesn't feel the need to explain every decision. Someone who doesn't automatically say yes just to keep things comfortable.
That kind of person moves differently.
They do. Not in a loud or aggressive way, in a calm, grounded way. They know what matters to them, and they act accordingly.
And that clarity shows.
It shows in how they speak, how they respond, and how they spend their time.
Because their choices are intentional.
Exactly. And here's something important. When you start living like this, you don't just gain control over your time, you gain respect for yourself.
And that changes how you feel on a daily basis.
Yes, you feel lighter, less overwhelmed, more focused.
Because you're no longer carrying commitments that don't belong to you.
And you're no longer saying yes out of fear.
You're saying yes because you genuinely want to.
That's the difference. Your yes becomes meaningful because it's no longer automatic.
And your no becomes powerful because it's intentional.
Exactly. And over time, people start to see that.
They start understanding your boundaries without you having to explain them every time.
Because you've been consistent.
And consistency builds trust.
Yes. Not just with others, but with yourself.
That might be the most important part of all.
It is. Because when you trust yourself, decisions become easier. You don't overthink as much. You don't second-guess every choice.
You know where you stand.
Exactly. And that sense of stability is what most people are looking for, even if they don't realize it.
So in the end, this isn't just about saying no.
No. It's about taking responsibility for your time, your energy, and your life.
And understanding that every decision you make shapes that.
Yes. Every yes, every no, it all adds up.
So the real question becomes, what kind of life are you building with your choices?
Because once you start choosing intentionally, everything changes.
And that's where real freedom begins.